Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of Cut Rate Commander, the series in which we take a look at low-priced commanders and make budget decks with them. My name is Grazzet and today we'll be looking at the shady wandering merchant, Old Rutstein. Before we continue, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you like this content and would like me to continue making more videos like this in the future. And if you're feeling particularly generous, consider buying me a coffee at the link in the description to keep me caffeinated as I work on more of these builds. Also be sure to stick around until the end of the video to see who won last week's poll and what commanders you'll be voting for Kamigawa Neon Dynasty for an upcoming episode. So with that out of the way, let's start by taking a look at the commander and playstyle. Old Rutstein is a 1/4 human peasant that costs 1 a green and a black with the following ability. When Old Rutstein enters the battlefield or at the beginning of your upkeep, mill a card. If a land is milled this way, create a treasure token. If a creature is milled this way, create a 1/1 insect creature token. If a non-creature non-land card is milled this way, create a blood token. As we can see, Old Rutstein is sporting a relatively low CMC, a fairly sturdy defensive stat block for the cost, and a mill-focused ability that gets us a lot of small bonuses as he fills our graveyard. Looking more in depth into this ability, we'll see that there isn't a whole lot under the surface as we'll be getting right what it says on the tin. A free mill on our upkeep, and either a creature, treasure, or blood token depending on what we mill this way. And while this ability certainly isn't something that many people would consider flashy, it is most certainly reliable. The free extra body, source of ramp, or card selection each provide a lot of utility, and the self-mill, while small, does add up over time and is certainly usable by an Eaglegari build that aims to use their graveyard. Not to mention, since our commander's ability isn't nearly as impactful as others on the table, Old Rutstein is fairly safe from targeted removal, as it will likely be aimed at bigger targets, allowing him to stick around for longer and passively generate us value turn after turn. So, aiming to make the most out of his self-mill and generic utility, this build will be focusing on getting us as much value out of our graveyard as possible, specifically focusing on getting as many creatures as we can into it, with Old Rutstein and other self-mill effects helping us fill our graveyard to the brim with bodies and getting us value as we do so. Looking at our creature base first, we'll be running an absolutely massive number of creatures to ensure that every time we mill, we're likely to hit some, meaning that most of our core stats, such as ramp, card draw, and removal, will be on bodies, giving us value if we draw into them or fueling our game plan if they're milled away. But getting creatures into our bin is only part of the equation, as we'll be running 2 different kinds of payoffs to take maximum advantage of our overcrowded crypts. The first are going to be creatures whose power and toughness are specifically linked to the amount of creatures we have in our graves, easily outmuscling any other creatures they come across as our graveyard fuels their stats to enormous proportions. And as they go tall, our second set of payoffs aims to go wide, focusing instead on making enormous armies of tokens based on the number of creatures we have in our grave, creating instant armies for us and overwhelming our opponents through sheer numbers. Both of our payoffs making our opponents choose whether they want to be crushed by a singular massive threat or overrun by an army of smaller ones. And even as our opponents manage to destroy our creatures or wipe our boards, death is more of an inconvenience for them than anything, as we have plenty of ways to recur them back to hand with their own or other effects, as well as having creatures who actively want to be in the grave to gain us benefits. Ensuring any removal our opponents use on them merely delays the inevitable as they claw themselves back from their graves to fight again, or further empower our game plan. So let's see what wares Old Rutstein has for sale for us today. Sure, he may have knickknacks and trinkets for the common folks up front, but the real valuables are what he keeps in the back. All manners of beasties to tear men limb from limb and concoctions to keep them fighting long after they've been slain. All at reasonable cost, of course. So I suppose the question is now, what you buying? So now that we know a bit more about the commander and playstyle, let's start looking at the deck itself by starting with the creatures. Starting in the CMC 1 slot, we have a pair of Mana Dorks with Llanowar Elves and Fyndhorn Elves, both of which are 1/1s that tap for a green, giving us a decent bump in ramp early and fueling our graveyard payoffs later if they're milled or removed. Caustic Caterpillar then joins us as another 1/1 green entrant, allowing us to pay 1 a green and sack it to destroy target artifact or enchantment, making it a decent piece of removal on a body that we can use when needed and then send off to the grave to add another body to the pile. A mill source then joins us with Stitcher Supplier, a 1/1 that, when it ETBs or dies, mills us for 3, getting us a solid 6 cards in the bin during its life cycle for some very efficient graveyard filling. Then we close out this slot with a new entrant from Kamigawa, Dockside Chef, a 1/2 that lets us pay 1 a black and sack a creature or artifact to draw a card, effectively making it a vampiric rights on a body that's capable of turning any token our commander creates into draw for some cheap and repeatable card advantage. Moving on to the CMC2 slot, we have some self-milling ramp entrants with Skull Prophet and another entrant from Neon Dynasty, Shigeki Jukai Visionary. Skull Prophet is a 3/1 that lets us tap it for either of our colors or instead tap it to mill ourselves for 2, giving us a mana dork to drop early for the ramp that we can turn into self-mill when we no longer need the mana. Shigeki is a 1/3 that we can pay 1, a green, tap him, and return him back to our hand to reveal the top 4 cards of our deck, putting a land from among them into play tapped and sending the rest to the grave. In addition to having channel for double X and double green to return X non-legendary cards from our grave back to our hand. His activated ability allowing him to serve both as a repeatable source of ramp and way to fill up our grave, while his channel turns him into a powerful recursion source to get those cards back from our bin once we no longer need the ramp, all of which makes him an exceptional addition to our build. More self-mill then joins us as we move deeper into this slot with Satyr Wayfinder, Glowspore Shaman, and Undead Butler. Satyr Wayfinder is a 1/1 that, when it ETBs, has us reveal the top 4 cards of our deck, putting a land from among them into our hand while sending the rest to our grave, usually making sure we make our land drops per turn and filling up our bin as it does so. Glowspore Shaman is a 3/1 that mills us for 3 when it ETBs, then puts a land from our grave back on top of our deck, ensuring our commander will generate a treasure on the following turn as that land gets milled for a bit of belated ramp to go with our mill. Undead Butler is a 1/2 that, when it ETBs, mills us for 3 and, when it dies, lets us exile it to return another creature card from our grave back to hand, giving us some good 2-for-1 value as an additional mill source as it comes in and a recursion source as it goes out. Golgari Thug then joins us as another self-mill source, a 1/1 that, when it dies, puts target creature from our grave back on top of our deck and has Dredge 4, making it a superb card to mill into as we can bring it back to hand by milling ourselves even more instead of drawing, and even letting us set up the top of our deck with a creature we want back every time it dies, though we will need to have a draw source handy to get it before our commander mills it away again. A trio of creatures that care about the body count in our grave then join us as we enter the halfway mark with Fiend Artisan, Old Stickfingers, and Boneyard Worm. Fiend Artisan is a 1/1 that gains +1/+1 for each creature in our grave, and lets us pay X, a hybrid black-green, tap it and sack a creature to put a creature from our deck of CMC X or less into play at sorcery speed. Not only making itself enormous thanks to the sheer amount of creatures we would have milled away, but its activated ability also letting us turn our tokens and unwanted creatures into our payoffs, speeding up our game plan considerably. Old Stickfingers is an X creature whose power and toughness is equal to the number of creatures we have in our grave, and, when it ETBs, has us reveal cards from the top of our deck until we reveal X creatures, sending any creatures revealed this way to our graveyard while sending any other cards to the bottom of our deck in a random order, giving us another enormous body that can make itself and all our other payoffs bigger by dumping more bodies into the graveyard. Boneyard Worm is a star whose stats match the number of creatures we have in our grave, not having any additional abilities like the previous entrants, but its low cost and bulk still making it worth running. Then a pair of land ramp sources join us with Sakura Tribelder and Dawn Treader Elk, both of which we can sack to put a basic land from our deck into play tapped, the former being a 1/1 that costs nothing to do this, while the latter is a 2/2 that costs a green to do this, both growing our mana curve nicely, then sending themselves away to the bin to power up our payoffs. Finally, we close out this slot with Priest of the Forgotten Gods, a 1/2 that we can tap and sack 2 other creatures to have any number of target players lose 2 life and sack a creature while we generate 2 black mana and draw a card, turning the insects our commander creates and other unwanted creatures into edict removal, ramp, and card advantage for a huge amount of value. Now entering the CMC3 slot, we have another trio of graveyard payoffs with Boneyard Mycodrax, Splinter Fright, and Night Howler. Boneyard Mycodrax is a star whose stats are equal to the number of other creatures we have in our graveyard and has Scavenge for 4 and a black, serving as another huge body when it hits the field, but giving us the option to transfer its power to another creature from the grave if we can't recur it. Splinter Fright is another star whose stats are equal to the number of creatures we have in our grave, as well as having trample and milling us for 2 on our upkeep. Its built-in trample allowing it to crash through blockers more easily, and the additional mill helping it and our other payoffs grow even faster. Night Howler is a 0/0 with Bestow for 2 and double black that gives the enchanted creature or itself +X/+X, where X is equal to the number of creatures in all graveyards, this time taking advantage of all the graves to power itself up and giving us the option to attach it as an aura to another creature, providing an impressive boost in power especially when combined with other graveyard payoffs, and even leaves itself behind as a body if the enchanted creature is dealt with. More ramp then joins us with Farhaven Elf and Springbloom Druid, both of which are 1/1s that put additional lands from our deck into play tapped when they ETB, the former putting 1 basic into play, while the latter has a sack a land, then put 2 basics into play, both providing us additional ramp on bodies to keep growing our mana curve and later our graveyard. Some removal options on bodies are then up next with Reclamation Sage and Thrashing Brontodon, both of which destroy target artifact or enchantment, the former being a 2/1 and doing so when it ETBs, while the latter being a 3/4 that we can pay 1 in sack to do this instead, each serving as efficient back row disruption that we can easily recur later. Moving even deeper into this slot, we have a pair of draw options joining us with Fell Stinger and Skullport Merchant. Fell Stinger is a 3/2 with Death Touch and Exploit that, if it exploits, has target player draw 2 cards and lose 2 life. Its Sign in Blood-like effect giving us some solid card advantage while leaving behind a scary defensive body to deter attacks. Skullport Merchant is a 1/4 that creates a treasure when it ETBs and lets us pay 1 a black and sack a creature or treasure to draw a card. Again, giving us more ways to get unwanted creatures into the bin, or using up 2 out of the 3 tokens our commander creates and turning them into card advantage. Going back to the mill plan, we have another pair of mill sources joining us with Stinkweed Imp and a Nyx Weaver. Stinkweed Imp is a 1/1 flyer with effectively Death Touch and Dredge 5, making it quite the annoying defensive creature for our opponents to deal with, as we can easily trade with it and then get it right back by milling ourselves over and over again. Nyx Weaver is a 2/3 with reach that mills us for 2 on our upkeep, and we can pay 1, a black, a green, and exile it to return a card from our grave back to our hand, serving as a decent source of steady mill initially, which we can later use to return any card back from our grave to hand for a great source of recursion. Then we close out this slot with Eternal Witness, a 2/1 that, when it ETBs, returns target card from our grave to hand, making it a very straightforward but effective recursion piece to get any resources we may need back from the bin, while also being easily recurable itself. Proceeding to the CMC4 slot, we have even more graveyard payoffs, starting us off with Jarad Golgari Lich, Mordivore, and Lurgoyf. Jarad is a 2/2 that gains +1/+1 for each creature in our grave and lets us pay 1, a black, a green, and sack another creature to have each opponent lose life equal to the sacked creature's power, as well as letting us sack a swamp and a forest to return him from our grave to our hand. His abilities making him both a hard-hitting and hard-to-get-rid-of threat, as well as turning most of our graveyard payoffs into big AoE damage for that extra reach. Mordivore and Lurgoyf both have stats that are equal to the number of creatures in all graveyards, the former having Regenerate for a black, and the latter having an additional toughness, providing us with yet more big bodies that this time take advantage of everyone's graveyards. Undergrowth Scavenger and Rhizome Lurcher then join us as even more graveyard payoffs, both of which get +1/+1 counters when they ETB equal to the amount of creatures in graveyards, the former being a 0/0 that gains counters equal to the number of creatures in all graves, while the latter's a 2/2 that only counts creatures in ours, making them somewhat more stable graveyard payoffs that may not grow as our graveyard does after they enter the battlefield, but also don't shrink down to nothing if we get hit with graveyard hate. Some recursion sources are then up next with Golgari Findbroker, Acolyte of Affliction, and Timeless Witness, all of which return a card from our grave back to hand when they ETB. The first being a 3/4 that returns only permanents, the second being a 2/3 that also hits only permanents and mills us for 2 before it recurs the card, and the last being a 2/1 that can recur any card and has Eternalized for 5 and double green, giving us a decent suite of recursion on bodies to continually get our payoffs back to hand, while they themselves also being easily recurable. Some green entrants then join us as we close in on the end of this slot with Beast Whisperer, World Shaper, and Brawn. Beast Whisperer is a 2/3 that draws us a card whenever we cast a creature spell, taking full advantage of our 50 creature strong deck to get us a superb amount of card advantage as we cast them. World Shaper is a 3/3 that mills us for 3 whenever it attacks and, when it dies, puts all lands from our grave into play tapped, putting our opponents in the awkward position of either letting it keep attacking and filling our graveyard or removing it and gifting us an enormous amount of ramp as they do so. Brawn is another 3/3 that gives all creatures we control trample so long as it's in the grave and we control a forest, making it a superb way to allow most of our graveyard payoffs to punch through blockers that's difficult for our opponents to interact with without graveyard hate. Finally, we close out this slot with Ravenous Chupacabra, a 2/2 that, when it ETBs, destroys target creature, providing us with yet another removal effect on a body that we can easily recur again and again from our bin to use as needed. Moving on to the CMC5 slot, we have another increase to our graveyard payoffs with Golgari Grave Troll, Revenant, and Kessig Cagebreakers. Golgari Grave Troll is a 0/0 with Dredge 6 that, when it ETBs, gains +1/+1 counters equal to the number of creatures we have in our graveyard, as well as letting us pay 1 and remove a counter to regenerate him, making him one of our most resilient threats that's capable of both protecting himself on the field and coming back from our grave, ensuring that he'll stick around to crash into our opponents again and again. Revenant is a star flyer whose stats are equal to the number of creatures we have in our grave. Its built-in evasion easily allowing it to bypass blockers and take huge chunks out of our opponent's life totals with its sizable bulk. Kessig Cagebreakers is a 2/4 that, when it attacks, creates a 2/2 wolf creature token that's tapped and attacking for each creature in our graveyard, going wide instead of tall by flooding our board with 2/2s if our graveyard is well stocked, usually generating 10+ bodies per swing to overwhelm our opponents with sheer numbers. Some black creature destruction then joins us as we pass the halfway point with Shriekmaw and Massacre Girl. Shriekmaw is a 3/2 with Fear and Evoke for 1 and a black that, when it ETBs, destroys target non-artifact, non-black creature, which will be casting most of the time for its Evoke cost to serve as a cheap removal spell, who then sends itself to the bin to either be recurred or used to power up our other payoffs. Massacre Girl is a 4/4 with Menace that, when she ETBs, has each other creature gain -1/-1 until end of turn and repeats this process every time a creature dies, easily wiping out most if not the entirety of our opponent's boards thanks to the passive 1/1 our commander generates, and leaving itself and possibly some of our payoffs intact depending on the size of our graveyards. Then we end this slot with Genesis, a 4/4 that, on our upkeep if it's in our graveyard, lets us pay 2 and a green to return a creature from our grave back to hand, providing us with a repeatable source of recursion from the grave to keep our payoffs and utility creatures coming back again and again. Moving on to the CMC 6 slot, we have our second to last creature with a Zoni Thousand-Eyed, a 2/3 that, when she ETBs, creates a 1/1 insect token for every creature in our graveyard and lets us pay a black, a green, and sack a creature to gain 1 life and draw a card, immediately spawning us an army of 1/1s as soon as she hits the board, and enabling us to use both them and other creatures we would rather have in our graveyard as repeatable sources of card advantage and life gain. Finally, reaching the CMC 7 slot and our last creature, we have Lotleth Giant, a 6/5 that, when it ETBs, deals 1 damage to target opponent per creature in our graveyard, making it capable of dealing massive amounts of damage out of nowhere to unsuspecting opponents as it comes down, and because it's on a body, we can easily recur it ourselves to be used over and over again. That covers all our creatures, so let's move on to our instance. Skipping straight to the CMC 2 slot, we have our only 3 instants with Grisly Salvage, Corpse Churn, and Grapple with the Past. Grisly Salvage has us reveal the top 5 cards of our deck, putting a creature or land from among them into our hand while sending the rest to our graveyard, making it both good early to ensure we make our land drops, as well as late to dig for more creatures, all while filling our graves in the process. Both Corpse Churn and Grapple with the Past mill us for 3, then return a card from our grave back to hand, the former returning a creature and the latter a land, each allowing us to grow our graveyard further while recurring resources back from it. That covers all our instants, so let's move on to our sorceries. It's single entries all the way down in this category, starting in the CMC 2 slot with Ghoul-Caller's Harvest, which creates X 2/2 zombie tokens with Decayed, X being equal to half the number of creatures we have in our graveyard rounded up, and has flashback for 3, a black and a green, allowing us to create an instant army of zombies on the cheap to swing in with twice per game, and possibly more depending if we can recur it. Moving on to the CMC 3 slot, we have Dryad's Revival, which has us return a card from our grave back to hand and has flashback for 4 and a green, giving us another 2-for-1 spell, this one being capable of returning any of our resources to be used again. Then skipping to the CMC 5 slot, we have Spider Spawning, which creates a 1/2 spider token with reach for each creature in our graveyard, and has flashback for 6 and a black, providing us with yet another instant army spell to build huge board states, as well as helping us screen against pesky flyers that would otherwise be a problem. Casualties of War then joins us as our singular CMC 6 slot entrant, which has us destroy 1 or more of the following: target artifact, creature, enchantment, land, and or planeswalker, easily allowing us to hit most if not all of the available options for a solid amount of precision removal to deal with the biggest threats of each category on the board in a single swoop. Then, skipping to the CMC 8 slot, we have our last sorcery with Find and Finality, a split card whose find side costs 2 hybrid green-black and lets us return up to 2 target creatures from our grave back to hand for a cheap source of recursion, while its Finality side costs 4, a green and a black, puts 2 +1/+1 counters on target creature we control, then gives all creatures -4/-4 until end of turn, making it a serviceable non-destruction based wipe that's good with dealing with mid-sized creatures and leaving most of our payoffs alive to continue attacking our opponents after the dust settles. That covers all our sorceries, so let's move on to our enchantments. The CMC 1 slot starts us off with 2 sources of repeatable recursion in the form of Phyrexian Reclamation and Tortured Existence, both of which allow us to return a creature from our grave back to hand, the former by having us pay 1, a black and 2 life, and the latter by paying a black and discarding a creature card, each offering us repeatable ways to get our utility creatures, recursion, and payoffs back to our hand over and over again for minimal cost. Moving on to the CMC 2 slot, we have its only entrant with The Binding of the Titans, a saga whose first chapter mills everyone for 3, its second chapter exiling 2 cards from any graveyard and gaining us a life for each creature exiled this way, and its third chapter allowing us to return a creature or land from our grave back to our hand, serving as additional mill and recursion to further our game plan, while throwing in a bit of graveyard hate of our own as a bonus. Skipping over to the CMC 5 slot, we have our penultimate enchantment with Moldervine Reclamation, which lets us draw a card and gain a life whenever a creature we control dies, providing us with a steady stream of card advantage and life gain as our creatures die due to our opponents or our own effects for a substantial amount of value throughout the course of the game. Finally, reaching the CMC 6 slot and our last enchantment, we have Deadbridge Chant, which mills us for 10 when it ETBs, and on each of our upkeeps has us randomly choose a card from our graveyard, putting it into play if it's a creature or into our hand if it's anything else. Its initial mill loading up our graveyard very nicely, and the repeatable recursion and reanimation it provides allowing us to continue getting value out of our graveyard turn after turn. That covers our enchantments, and since we have no artifacts in this build, we'll move straight to our Planeswalkers. Our only walker joins us in the CMC3 slot, that being Grist the Hunger Tide, who comes into play with 3 loyalty and has the following abilities. Her passive makes her a 1/1 insect creature so long as she's not on the battlefield. Her +1 mills us for 1 and creates a 1/1 insect token, repeating the process if we mill an insect. Her -2 has a sack a creature to destroy target creature or planeswalker, and her -5 has each opponent lose life equal to the number of creatures we have in our graveyard. Her passive allowing us to easily recur her again and again thanks to the large amount of creature recursion we have at our disposal, while the extra mill, sack outlet removal, and big damage graveyard focused ultimate make her an excellent addition to further our deck's game plan. That covers our planeswalker, so let's move on to our land base. Starting off with our mana lands, we have Command Tower, which taps for any color in our commander's color identity, Llanowar Wastes, which taps for colorless or either our colors if we take a damage, Tainted Wood, which taps for colorless or either our colors if we control a swamp, Necroblossom Snarl, which comes into play tapped unless we reveal a forest or swamp and taps for either of our colors, Golgari Rot Farm, which comes into play tapped, bounces a land we control back to hand when it ETBs and taps for both our colors. Myriad Landscape, which comes into play tapped, taps for a colorless and we can pay 2, tap it and sack it to put 2 of the same basic land from our deck into play tapped. And finally Evolving Wilds and Terramorphic Expanse, both of which we can tap and sack to put a basic land from our deck into play tapped. Moving on to our utility lands, we start off with Bojuka Bog, Dakmor Salvage, and Hissing Quagmire. Bojuka Bog comes into play tapped, taps for a black, and exiles target player's graveyard when it ETBs, giving us a powerful source of graveyard exile from the land slot to ensure that we're the only ones benefiting from it. Dakmor Salvage also comes into play tapped and taps for a black as well as having Dredge 2, allowing us to get it back from the grave if milled and getting us additional cards in our grave if we recur it. Hissing Quagmire comes into play tapped as well, taps for either our colors, and lets us pay 1, a black and a green to turn it into a 2/2 Death Touch creature until the end of the turn, effectively serving as a surprise kill spell from the land slot if our opponents aren't careful with their attacks. Finally, we close out our utility lands with Svakdos the Restless Tomb, which taps for a colorless and we can pay 3, a black and a green to turn it into a plant zombie creature whose power and toughness are equal to the number of creatures we have in our graveyard, giving us our last graveyard payoff, which we can create at instant speed to add a huge amount of power to our board on our opponent's turns. Finally, we're running 11 swamps and 13 forests as our basics to close out our land base. So now that we've covered all the cards in the deck, let's take a look at this deck's breakdown. Currently, this deck has 50 creatures including the commander, 3 instants, 5 sorceries, 5 enchantments, 0 artifacts, 1 planeswalker, and 36 lands. Looking at the stats that matter to our game plan, we have 23 sources of self-mill, 18 sources of recursion, 20 cards that care about creatures being in the graveyard, and 11 cards with effects that work while they're in the graveyard, leaving us with plenty of ways to fill up our graveyard, alongside a solid number of ways to recur our resources from it or benefit from the massive creature count within it, and even having a handful of cards that are still usable from the graveyard for additional benefit. For general deck stats, we have 12 ramp sources, 7 card draw sources, 9 targeted removal sources, and 2 board wipes. Our draw being slightly lower than normal, but we make up for it by getting most of our card advantage from our graveyard instead, while our other stats are pretty close to where we want to see them. Looking at our mana curve, we have 7 1-drops, 17 2-drops, 15 3-drops, 12 4-drops, 8 5-drops, 3 6-drops, 1 7-drop, and 1 8-drop. Giving us a mid-weight curve that aims to drop our commander early to get the self-mill plan going while gaining the benefits from the tokens he passively generates, flooding our graveyard with creatures as quickly as we can, then playing and recurring our payoffs to benefit from it. Currently, this deck is valued at $64.61, not counting the price of basic lands or shipping. This price was calculated by using the cheapest listed marketplace price on TCG Player at the time of this recording. For side grades, some more self-mill cards such as Crop Sigil, Crawling Sensation, and Crawling Infestation would be fine includes to get more cards into our bin, while some additional graveyard payoffs such as Necrogoyf, Grave Strength, and Bone Horde give us even more ways to take advantage of our creature-loaded graveyards. And if you really want to test your might with an alternate win condition, Mortal Kombat is an easily achievable way to win the game outright, since getting 20 plus creatures into the grave is certainly no issue for this build. For upgrades, Lord of Extinction is another great graveyard payoff that gets massive thanks to all the cards in both our and our opponent's graveyards. Hermit Druid gives us a substantial amount of self-mill and ensures we make our land drops. Underrealm Lich serves as an equal part card selection and graveyard setup source that's quite difficult to remove thanks to its on-demand indestructibility. And Life from the Loam gives us a repeatable way to recur our lands from our grave again and again and mill ourselves further as we do so. Finally, Volrath's Stronghold is a land that can recur our creatures for a very reasonable mana rate and totally unreasonable price point of over $100. If this is anything to go by, maybe flipping properties isn't such a bad idea after all. Thanks everyone for sticking around until the end of the video. First things first, I'd like to thank and welcome the newest 100 subscribers to the channel, as with the help of your support as well as our older subs, we've been able to crack the 2.9k milestone. Thank you all for your support, as this channel would be unable to grow without it. Moving on to the results of last week's poll, it looks like Anji was able to make it out on top of the free-for-all to be the last commander from Crimson Vow we'll be covering for now, so look forward to a Blood Token themed build featuring her next week. Looking at next week's poll, now that Kamigawa Neon Dynasty is upon us, we'll be pumping the brakes on our usual programming and instead have the two precons go head-to-head to see which one we'll be covering first in a Cut Rate Commander precon upgrade guide. So cast your vote for either Buckle Up or Upgrades Unleashed in the Community tab, link in the description, and let me know in the comments who you voted for and which new commanders from Neon Dynasty you're most excited about and want me to build decks around. Before we close out, again, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't done so already, as this channel cannot grow without your support. And if you feel like showing your thanks by keeping me caffeinated while I make these videos, please consider buying me a coffee at the link in the description. Speaking of which, I'd like to thank Dark Spectre for their generous donation. Thanks for the coffee, and thanks for supporting the channel. And if any of you would like to support the channel in a different way, feel free to check out the other deck techs floating around my head if you'd like to see the latest builds, or click on the link above for a playlist of all the Cut Rate Commander episodes I've made so far. And with that, have a good one folks, and stay safe.